Horror. Horror.
My name is Mari Shibata. I was born in Japan and have lived in the UK for the past 16 years. After the earthquake and tsunami in Japan in March 2011, the UK news coverage at first depicted the true horror facing my Japanese peers. Yet, within 24 hours, as soon as the Fukushima nuclear plant story hit the news, everything changed. The press seemed to go berserk with meltdown headlines, Apocalypse Now-style scenarios, whipping up and reinforcing fears of global nuclear catastrophe. The real disaster seemed to disappear from the news. No one died from radiation leaks from the Fukushima plant, whereas the latest figures from the earthquake and tsunami in August 2011 confirmed 16,447 dead. 4,787 are still missing, and 5,888 people were injured. Fear, it seems, had changed the story in the media from the real horror of the tsunami to one of nuclear catastrophe. Along with WORLDwrite volunteers, I decided to investigate the fear factor, and as you'll see, we even gained rare access to a nuclear power plant. To set the scene and update you, this is the latest from talking to my family in Japan. How have you been? How's the situation over in Japan?
Things have changed. I mean, a lot of the wreckage has been cleared up, and
Oh, really?
yeah, a lot of universities. I mean, for example, I might be taking part in a volunteer group.
Oh, really?
There are still lots of people homeless, and there are still tens and thousands of people still in these facilities. So, in that sense, not everything is back to normal. The volunteer work, until a month ago, was mostly clearing up wreckage. It was still, the process of having to clear up all this wreckage and bits and bobs of houses and, cars and all this thing. But this summer, for example, my university is sending a volunteer group up into one of the most worst affected areas, but it's more or less the mental care for those in the facilities. It's more talking to people and sort of taking care of the children. Roads are back to normal.
And how about the trains and stuff? Because I remember there was a huge train line that was sort of derailed and it sort of collapsed after the earthquake.
Yeah, the main train lines are back to normal. The bullet train that runs from Tokyo to the sort of north parts of Japan, that's all back to normal now. So a lot of people are able to get in and out. And also the roads are fine as well. So
Wow.
a lot of people have come to Tokyo from these areas.
So on the electricity side, are the shortages there because of the Fukushima plant that's kind of fallen apart, or is it something else?
It's, of course, the plant has some stuff to do with this, but it's more primitive stuff like, getting the lines in place. And
Okay.
because most of the homes have been washed out, there's not really much homes to provide electricity to. Of course, there is actually a lot of progress going on in these areas. I mean, yeah, without government support, a lot of people are just doing it on their own. That is quite impressive. It has been 6 months, so there has been a lot of progress in that sense.
To give you a clear picture, I think we should distinguish the affected areas and the other parts of Japan. Because if you see the situation, if you hear the situation just in the affected areas, you have an impression that the whole country is still like that. But Jun has been talking about the affected areas, how the situation is.
Which is only a small space.
Yeah. So, Japanese economy on the whole, for example, we had supply chain issues after the earthquake, but it has resolved, and the production has rebounded, and the economy is starting to pick up. And we have entered into the phase of the reconstruction spending. So clearly, in the country as a whole, it's working. And talking about the electric shortages, there has been a concern that there will be a shortage of electricity this summer in Tokyo. But thanks to the cooperative manners of the Japanese companies and also the private citizens, the electricity shortage did not happen.
Oh, yeah, there's been applications made for, say, your iPod, and you can check how much electricity has been used in Tokyo so far.
Seriously.
It's real time. I can show you now. Can you see this? It's
71%.
or
Of electricity supplies being used in... Oh, wow.
That shows sort of, we still have 30 or odd so percentage of electricity we can still use at this moment.
But even in peak times, this calculator shows it's around 90%. So we still have 10%.
We have a buffer.
So is there much debate then on the nuclear side of the story? Because over here in the West, the press have often focused about the nuclear debate.
If you watch the news, a week after the earthquake, it was just videos of the earthquake being shown. But now I think the debate has shifted to the nuclear problem and the industries of Japan and how they're going to get over this. And it's more or less about the power debate now, I think, isn't electricity and all this. Because, Japan isn't, a very resourceful country. It doesn't have much oil, it doesn't have too much coal either. So nuclear energy is quite imperative for the industries of Japan. The Fukushima power plant, did have a crisis there, but Fukushima is in a very sort of northern part of Japan, and it doesn't affect anywhere like Tokyo. To exaggerate and make this all hysterical and sort of sensational, I think, was something that the Western media couldn't have avoided, to actually get readers and people to watch, their programs and so on and so forth. So I don't blame the Western media for all this, sort of hysteria, but I do think it was slightly exaggerated. Quite fairly exaggerated. It's not this sort of nuclear horror that sort of covers the whole country. Fukushima, there's hardly anybody living there to start with. True, there was an evacuation zone, and that did, show some concern. I have some friends who used to live there, but I don't think it's as big a crisis as the Western media have sort of, thought to put it.
I think a lot of the Western media have compared this accident to Chernobyl, but I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have forgotten that this is a natural disaster, not a human disaster. Chernobyl was a human disaster, which was due to the lack of safety regulations within the plant. It wasn't run properly, which caused Chernobyl to sort of blow up and contaminate the whole area, so on and so forth. But Fukushima was, it actually survived the earthquake. It was constructed strong enough to survive an earthquake, as in shake, of 8.9 on the Richter scale. But it was just that nobody had expected a sort of 10-meter tsunami to come along. The tsunami itself exceeded 10 meters in height, and there was only a wall designed for a 4-meter tsunami. In that sense, there is the argument that, why didn't you build a sort of higher wall? But then this is an earthquake, a once in a 200, 300 years kind of earthquake, and an earthquake of this scale has never been measured in Japan. I think what I'd like to say to the Western media is that this disaster wasn't because the plant, was not safe. The technology is safe, it's just that a tsunami, which nobody really, expected would come, had hit the plant. I think, it's a little bit unfair to compare this to Chernobyl, I think. Yeah.
My family are very forgiving, but why did the Western media go overboard? To find out more, we met with Fiona Fox, director of the Science Media Centre in London. After the earthquake in Japan, we're very concerned by the fact that there was a huge level of scaremongering stirred by the reporters and the press, to the point where the actual, what's happened has been distorted, and it's not really focused on the tragic event, the natural disaster that happened.
I think what forced me to write on a BBC blog, and I know a lot of BBC journalists, they're my friends, but to be openly critical was the lack of proportionality. The fact that only 24 hours after the most horrendous, tragic, gargantuan natural disaster of an earthquake followed by this tsunami, that the only story in town was about the Fukushima incident, about the nuclear incident. And I know that because I was actually away for the weekend and picked up my phone on the Saturday after having lined up all these great earthquake experts, tsunami experts, marine experts, you know, the right kind of experts from our database, which is how we operate. I then immediately on the Saturday morning started getting calls. They only wanted nuclear experts. And I hadn't got my nuclear experts ready. And actually on the Monday, we decided the best thing to do would be to run one of our emergency press briefings. The hunger in the media for this story was massive. Nobody had a single question about the earthquake itself, the potential for aftershocks, the consequences long term, the warnings, all the things that we thought would be of interest to the media. They only wanted to know about the risks from the nuclear incident. And what they particularly wanted to know, and asked many times, is what is the worst case scenario? So it seemed that there was an agenda set that their editors wanted, and you know, later on, when I started to really reflect on this and talk to the journalists off record, and said, you know, why was it this massive desire for that scare story when you already had a terrible scare story? It wasn't as if we were asking them to cover the good news, not the bad news. There was plenty of bad news. And actually one or two of them were very open with me and said, Fiona, our editors think there is something uniquely terrifying about radiation. There is something unique to that word that has the capacity to really terrify people. And I think at that moment you just have to pause for a minute and think, my goodness, what a strange set of news values, that what justifies the amount of coverage is what your editors feel terrifies people. There are some more sophisticated explanations for why these news values set in, but I think the one that you really have to question is the one that says, because we couldn't see it, because it was uniquely terrifying, therefore we felt compelled to cover it. And on that, I just beg to differ. I beg to differ that that is morally justifiable as a news value. And I think your relatives and family in Japan would beg to differ.
It's not something very nice, and you know, to think if you see sort of, I mean, my father I think told me about, was it some kind of cartoon written on some?
The New York Times.
Oh yeah. Well, back in April there was a cartoon of the this is a conversation between Snow White and the witch, and the witch hands over an apple to the Snow White, and the Snow White asks, "Do you come from Japan?" So it's the sort of image that the whole of Japan is contaminated was quite disappointing for me, and to see the Western media sort of making a whole big deal about to over-exaggerate it and make Japan a sort of apocalyptic sort of cataclysmic calamity is slightly going too far, and that was very disappointing.
As officials in Japan still battle around the clock to regain full control of the damaged nuclear plant in Fukushima, traces of radiation have been detected for the first time across Britain. Air samples taken in Glasgow and Oxfordshire have revealed very low levels of radioactive iodine, indicating that the fallout from the nuclear disaster has spread more than 5,000 miles.
Maybe they were wanting to focus on that because it possibly might have an effect on the people outside of Japan.
I think that's a really good point, actually. You're right. So, and in fact, I used to work for an overseas aid agency, and you guys working for WORLDwrite will know about this very much, that the British media are not that interested in the developing world or anywhere outside of the UK. So they're always looking for a UK angle. And I think that's absolutely true, that there was something about the possibility that the plume, as they call it, that the wind would blow this radiation in. And if you remember 3 or 4 days later when they did some readings in the soil in Glasgow, and they found some uranium, and it was just massive scare. Now, again, one of the things I'd like to use this interview to say is that what you really, really need at times like this is the real experts, the people who really know what they're talking about. Now, the Science Media Centre's job was to line up people who know about radiation, who know about its effects on humans, who know about its effects on the environment and soils and food, etc. And we lined all of them up, and without exception, they were all giving quite measured, they said from the beginning, this is a very, very serious incident. But in terms of it being a threat even to people in Tokyo, never mind to people in Glasgow, they were expressing time after time that this threat was very, 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 very small. And they were also dismayed about the fact that the entire world's media were focusing on the threat of radiation, which they felt, apart from the people in the exclusion zone, was very small. And indeed, they still feel is very small.
I've never heard of anybody who's died in this incident, and nobody has been contaminated by radiation, but it's just, say for example, agricultural areas around Fukushima. There have been measurements, the government measures every day, sort of the amounts of radioactive substances in, say, grass or tea leaves that have been produced in the area, and that has shown a little bit of reaction to the nuclear incident. So, you know, the sort of health and safety of this plant has sort of been a concern for the agricultural department in Japan, but there hasn't really been such calamity there.
Yeah, that's right. There is just one report about the, one death. Well, a construction worker died at the Fukushima plant. But this is because of overwork, not because of the radiation.
Yeah.
So.
Because it's a radioactive area, people don't want to go there, and so there's not really many workers who sort of, go to the plant to sort of try and fix it. So it's about a team of, say, 100 people, and they're sort of constantly on the site, and they have to work. Right now the temperature outside is about 30, 34, 35 degrees, and you're wearing all these suits, and you're sweating inside the plant trying to get this back under control. So, overwork has caused one death so far, but no deaths have been reported due to nuclear contamination.
I mean, I remember in past disasters like that, where you didn't have a nuclear incident, the media would go back and look at the water supply. The media would go back and look at the impact of losing an entire electricity supply to parts of the country. There were 100 different stories that must have been developing stories. If you think about it, if a country has that major an incident, there must have been 100 things they could look at. What does it mean for families who've lost their homes? What does it mean to the education system if they can't get back to schools? But all of those questions that we quite often hear in a disaster just disappear. The irony, of course, now is they're now not interested in any of it. They've now moved on even from Fukushima. So those questions about how the country recovers from this are not even on the table for the national news media. They may go back once or twice. Those organisations with resources like the BBC may send a reporter in there occasionally, but it'll be 2 or 3 times this year if we're lucky.
I think Japan will be back up and running quite soon, and we'd like the Western media to come and sort of see how the country is getting up, and I think we'd like our government to sort of give more information out. To sort of help that.
In defence of the media, quite a lot of political commentators were making alarmist statements, and I think that's really important. What you often have is a media that, the journalists might be saying to their editor, we need to tone this down. Some of our experts are saying that this is not as bad as Chernobyl, and then the editor looks on the news and sees that the British ambassador has called people to leave Tokyo, or I think it was an EU commissioner who talked about apocalypse, and he said, I've thought about this, I think that is the right word for this. Which self-respecting Daily Mail journalist is not going to quote a leading EU commissioner? In fact, one of our scientists has since gone public in a scientific paper to criticise politicians for their alarmist statements.
In some quarters, they've suggested that nuclear experts have a vested interest in playing down a nuclear incident.
Absolutely, and this is for me a very interesting facet of this. I think you need to know in the Science Media Centre that we talk a lot to journalists, and so off the record they tell us things, and we're not going to say them on the record, but we had very many journalists coming to us and saying, my editor has said to me, what are the apologists saying today? Because we were running almost daily press briefings with different experts, and I mean really different experts, because some of these are human health people who work in hospitals. One of our experts works in hospital and works on radiography, but he knows about the effects of radiation on the inside of a person's body. Other experts live in Chernobyl. Other experts build nuclear power reactors and know that Fukushima was a very, very old model, and that the new ones that are going to be built in Britain will be very different. So there's a real range of experts experts. None of them actually worked for industry, as it happens, which you could easily be critical of industry. They on the whole, did not step up. They're mainly academics. But yeah, there was this idea that they would say that, wouldn't they? The idea that these leading scientists, you know, who publish in peer-reviewed journals, who work for very respected scientific institutions, are playing down an incident because they support the nuclear industry. That is quite a charge. You know, for scientists, that's really probably one of the most insulting things you could say, that they know something is bad, but they don't tell you that because they... And I also just don't buy it. You know, I think if your starting point is that people don't tell the truth because they're looking to the money, you get into the most bizarre of situations. And then who do you trust?
Fiona Fox raised serious concerns about news values and that terrifying word radiation. But, media hype or no, should we be terrified? Industry may not have stepped into the fray over Fukushima, but we were lucky enough to gain a unique glimpse of an operating station. This is Oldbury Power Station, run by the company Magnox for the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority.
Well, we're standing here on the top of the reactor building at Oldbury Power Station, and behind us you can see the Severn Estuary and the two bridges that link England to Wales. It's worth pointing out that the station was built in 1962. It's also worth noting that this is the oldest operating nuclear reactor in the world.
So are all the nuclear plants sort of a similar design? I mean, for example, is it similar to the one that's just kind of had a bit of a disaster over in Fukushima?
No, this plant is very different from Fukushima and from other plants around the world. Mainly new plants that are being built are pressurised water design, which is a very different design from this twin reactor plant here, which has two gas-cooled reactors, so they're very different.
Do you think an event like what's happened in Japan recently will ever happen here?
No.
And why do you say that?
Because of the plant design. The plant is inherently more stable, and we're in a location where we're not open to the same sort of threat from the environment as the Japanese plant was.
I understand there's been some concerns about the site of Oldbury. It's near the estuary, and also there's been a tidal surge a couple of hundred years ago.
I can understand people's concerns. There was a tidal surge in 1607, which is some 400 years ago. The power station is built above, well above the maximum tide height and anything that we're expecting. And really, people must consider that we're not built on a fault line as Fukushima was.
After Fukushima, we didn't get these insights, and the nuclear panic was so over the top. Being here, it's hard to understand what drives these fears.
So where do you think this appetite for a nuclear disaster actually comes from?
There's no doubt about it, and I don't even think they tried to hide it, that those, world leaders and UK-based politicians like the Green Party and Greenpeace and others, who are ideologically opposed to nuclear power, wasted no opportunity to come out and say, this shows why we should go for renewable energy. And, God love them, I would probably do it if I worked for those organisations. It was opportunist, but it's what they believe. That said, I do believe, and that's why I came out publicly and criticised the media, which is not something I do that often, that there is a responsibility within the editorial news editors in newsrooms to get the balance right of this kind of report. And I have said very openly, and I stand by it, that the proportionality of the way this was covered was wrong. And I feel confident in saying that because of how many journalists felt uneasy about this. I mean, I know of journalists who were taken off this story because what they were writing was too measured. And that is in a really significant major newsroom in this country.
It got to the extent where some of the authorities had to fly out people like expatriates or whatever who were living in Japan, fly them away to safety. I sort of read the irony in this situation really was that these people who were being flown out of Japan to escape the radiation actually received the same amount of radiation by going through airport security and flying on the plane than they would have received living for the whole year, like in Tokyo, for example. I mean, do you think people are willing to listen to actual facts from scientists and the truth about the matter, or do you think it's already gone too far down the line?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and one of the things, so the Science Media Centre are 3 or 4 press officers that pump out the best, most evidence-based, accurate science in the midst of these disasters. And it's important to say that if you added up the number of interviews we set up, actually you would feel more positive, because say we set up 300 interviews in a week, all of those interviews were with top experts. So that does tell you something good. That tells you that the media were happy to take these scientists, were happy to broadcast their view on this situation. And hundreds of thousands of people will have heard them. Now, million-dollar question, which the Science Media Centre never knows the answer to, did that make a difference? I do think there is another issue here, which is the public's understanding of radiation. I just don't think there is one, and you can blame the media for that, but you can also blame the scientific community for not doing more to engage with the public about the dangers of radiation. I think the example you gave about going through the scanners in the airport is absolutely a case in point. And, you know, people were pointing out, our experts were pointing out that radiation saves lives every day, and if you know anyone with cancer having radiotherapy, they will tell you that. So this idea that the news editors have, the unique ability of radiation to terrify people, is in itself a misnomer.
Being here at Oldbury certainly wasn't terrifying, and we were kitted out with safety shoes, helmets, and had personal radiation monitors strapped to us. The security and safety rigmarole we had to go through in fact seemed extraordinary.
Okay, so we're now standing in the what we call the pile cap viewing gallery, which is located pretty much up here upon the pile cap. The pile cap is the very top of the reactor. The reactor core and the pressure vessel is all below us. We're stood at the very top of the reactor. And what you can see from this model is that we have a pre-stressed concrete pressure vessel which keeps the reactor gas and the reactivity within this very safe area. Just to give you some idea, this concrete wall here is about 5 meters thick, and the top one, the pile cap level, is something like 7 meters thick. So it's very strong and very well designed concrete structure. Inside the pressure vessel, we have the reactor core, which is made up of thousands of graphite bricks. These bricks have channels in them, and the fuel elements sit inside those channels. And there's enough clearance between the fuel element and the channel to allow CO2 gas to be blown up through them. That gas extracts the heat from the nuclear reaction that's taking place in the reactor, and then is circulated down over the boilers. The boilers have water pumped into them, and that water turns to steam, which is then sent off to power the turbine and the alternator to make electricity. This machine down the bottom here is a gas circulator, which is really just a big fan, and there are 4 of these in the reactor that blow the gas up through the reactor core. Okay, if you look through this window, you see the pile cap, and you can see the slabs that make up the top of the reactor core. That's not the pressure vessel. The pressure vessel is many feet below that. But those slabs can be removed so that we can put new fuel into the reactor, and we can do inspection work and maintenance work. And there's no problem with going down onto the pile cap. You can see there are people working down there without any special clothes or breathing apparatus. It's a very clean place. It's only when we start taking things in and out that it could become contaminated, but we're always very careful.
But people are obviously quite concerned about the safety of nuclear plants. Have there been any cases where staff have kind of been caught in an accident, perhaps? You know, has anything like that happened when you?
We've had no nuclear accidents. People become contaminated now and again with very, very small amounts of particles, but those are always picked up by our monitoring systems, and it's very easily cleaned. So it's not an issue. It's something that we monitor very carefully and manage very carefully.
And how did they clean it, just out of interest?
Just can be washed off with soap and water.
Dave's straightforward answers did make the idea of radiation being uniquely terrifying seem ridiculous. We were left with little doubt that safety is the #1 concern here. Every inch of our film kit had to be carefully scanned with a Geiger counter type affair, and though we hadn't been near anything radioactive, we had to go through contamination checkpoints. Our sound gear was still being checked over at this point, but it sounded a bit like this.
3, 2, 1, no contamination.
It does seem extraordinary that some countries are now rethinking nuclear power altogether post-Fukushima.
It's been reported here in Japan quite largely that sort of Germany has stopped, nuclear power plants, and a lot of countries are sort of saying that nuclear, power plants aren't safe, let's leave this. But I don't know, I find it quite concerning because this would mean we'd have to resort to coal. I don't think there's much risk, say in Germany, of experiencing a 10-meter tsunami coming along and hitting their nuclear plant, or I doubt a 10-meter tsunami would hit the River Seine in France. I mean, it's all well for these countries to get all paranoid about this nuclear, matter, but I personally think that nuclear power is imperative, to get as much energy as possible to supply to your country and people, whilst cutting down carbon dioxide levels to a minimum.
So we hear about Germany, Switzerland, Italy, Thailand and Malaysia either shutting down their power plants or cutting back. Also there's been the president of TEPCO who's announced that he's going to resign a couple of weeks ago. How much influence do you think the media's played in this? Or how much do you think it's a business or political decision?
I can't give you an evidence-based answer. I know that everybody I have spoken to about Germany, everybody believes that that was a political decision. And I'm not even sure that anyone has tried to hide that. I think the German Chancellor has said, we are not going to build nuclear power stations in response to protest in Germany. And that's, it's a democracy, and that is her right. In the UK, I have to say, so far, Mike Whiteman, who is a brilliant expert himself, a former engineer, a nuclear inspector, he ran it just here in this room here. He ran his initial findings of his interim report about lessons learned, and he praised the Japanese people repeatedly for their reaction and said, of course, there are lessons to be learned, and there will be lessons to be learned, but we need to do this in a measured, thoughtful, reflective way. So I think actually the UK government, they will demand more safety measures, but they will not let this incident stop a policy, because we still need clean energy. So the reasons why countries needed nuclear before Fukushima have not changed one iota.
So typically, how much power can this provide in terms of population?
It's probably a city the size, 1.5 times the size of Bristol, okay. which is quite a large city.
Can you explain to us why reactor number 2 has shut down, whereas reactor number 1 has continued to operate?
Yeah, sure. I mean, basically, we've run out of fuel. The original design basis for the reactors was so good that through technology and through our learning, we've been able to extend the life of the site. As I said earlier, it's the oldest operating nuclear power station in the world because of the quality of build that was put in place to start off with. And effectively, we've run much longer and we've run out of fuel, and there's no more fuel to be made. What we'll be doing is transferring unused fuel from reactor 2 into reactor 1 so that it can operate at the highest power levels that we can sustain with that fuel.
So can you explain to us then what's going to happen after December 2012? Like, is everyone going to be moving away, or is there still work to be done?
Right, no, there's lots of work to be done. The first phase is to remove all the fuel. There are 26,000 fuel elements in each reactor, so there's an awful lot of fuel that has to be taken out and put in through the ponds to cool down, and then into the flasks and off to Sellafield to be reprocessed safely. The next stage then is to look at decommissioning some of the plant items, some of the items that we don't need any longer. We still need quite a significant amount of plant to ensure safety of the reactors as they're left, and to be able to do monitoring. And then the third stage really is to put the plant into a period of what we call care and maintenance, which allows the radiation levels in the reactors to decay until it's safe to actually demolish the buildings and then return it to a greenfield site.
Do you have any thoughts on the future of nuclear power? What will fill the gap after December 2012 when the plant shuts down?
Well, we're going to be relying on existing nuclear sites that are run by EDF in the UK, and of course traditional coal and oil-fired sources, plus support from alternative fuel sources, windmills and solar panels. But of course we're having a new site, hopefully here, at Shepherdine, which is just up the road, which is going to be built by a company called Horizon.
For a man who's been in the nuclear industry for a long time, do you often come across people who are very anti-nuclear?
I wouldn't say often come across people. I sometimes come across people that have a different point of view, and I understand and accept that.
And where do you think these fears come from?
It's very difficult to say. People have their own reasons. Perhaps they have a mistrust in something they don't fully understand. Nuclear power station, it's very difficult to go inside of it and have a look around and convince yourself that things are safe because you can't see what's going on. I understand why people are nervous, because I think it's down to quite a bit of trust in the professionalism of the company that's designed and built it, and as we are now operating it safely. And actually it's a shame, because it wasn't that many years ago that we were able to show parties of visitors around the site and actually show them what good condition the site is in and how safe it is. And it's only since 9/11 that we've had to stop inviting visitors. We've always had a very open policy, very keen to show people how good we are at what we do and how safe the plant is. And unfortunately 9/11 has put a stop to that. We now have security guards and we have very, very secure access arrangements.
Leaving Oldbury, it did seem sad that fear of terrorism now means the 30,000 visitors who used to visit Oldbury each year no longer can. Fear itself, it seems, can be damaging. But I should, like a good daughter, give my father the last word.
Well, although I'm not the Prime Minister of Japan, I'd like to express my gratitude for the kind support of the foreign countries. There are a number of people coming to Japan to help reconstructing the country. We also have many people, many students from overseas coming to Japan and help rebuilding the country. So we really appreciate that.
じゃあまた電話するね。